The VIP room at Serrano Memorial Hospital in downtown Chicago smelled of expensive disinfectant, wilted roses, and an ancient kind of fear, the sort that makes no sound, but clings to the back of your throat like a cold hand. Elena Navarro, her abdomen tight with premature contractions and her face pale from exhaustion, lifted her eyes toward the heavy oak door that had just clicked shut. Sealed inside with her were her husband, her mother-in-law, and the family's head attorney. The room felt less like a medical suite and more like a private courtroom where the verdict had already been decided long before anyone bothered to hear the evidence. As the cold Lake Michigan rain lashed against the glass windows overlooking the skyline, Elena realized she hadn't been brought here to be cared for. She had been brought here to be broken once and for all. On the mahogany side table, right next to an untouched pitcher of water, rested a navy blue leather folder bearing the embossed crest of the Serrano Health Group. It was as polished, elegant, and unforgiving as everything else belonging to that family. Julian Vance, the senior partner who always smiled as though he were admiring the majesty of the law while using it as a scalpel, opened the document with slow, practiced movements. He began reading aloud a series of clauses drafted with clinical precision: voluntary waiver of marital assets, immediate vacation of the marital residence, acceptance of a no-fault divorce based on irreconcilable differences involving moral misconduct, waiver of future alimony, and, tucked into an annex that made Elena's stomach turn, a provisional transfer of sole legal and physical custody of the unborn child to the Serrano family for reasons regarding the stability and welfare of the minor. Elena did not need a law degree to understand that this was not a negotiation. Nobody negotiates when they have placed 3 notarized affidavits on the table and 2 private security guards outside the door. Beatrice Serrano, pristine in her ivory suit, and a strand of pearls that read like a declaration of absolute superiority, watched her from the foot of the bed, with the icy calm of a woman who believed she stood entirely above sin. Beside her stood Mark, Elena's husband, refusing to make direct eye contact. He kept his gaze fixed on the storm outside, as if the torrential downpour over the loop was easier to bear than the shame of standing by while his family dismantled his wife. When Beatrice finally spoke, she did not raise her voice, and that made her words all the more devastating. She stated, with quiet certainty, that a woman who had betrayed her husband's trust did not deserve to raise a child bearing the Serrano name, nor did she deserve any continued association with their legacy. Elena tried to sit up higher against the pillows, but a sharp, pulling pain in her lower abdomen forced her to brace herself on one elbow. The fetal monitor beside her beeped at a faster rhythm, registering her spiking pulse. Even so, she gathered her breath and asked a question with a sudden, startling clarity that made everyone in the room visibly uncomfortable. If the family was so convinced the child did not carry a single drop of Mark's blood, why were they fighting so relentlessly to take him away? The question hung in the air like a heavy stone cast against a thin mirror. For a fleeting second, no one had an immediate answer. It was a tiny hesitation, almost invisible to an untrained eye, but Elena caught it. In that subtle silence, the first hairline fracture appeared in a truth that was far too massive to fit inside a single medical report. Mark turned his head toward her at last. The eyes that had once looked at her with unconditional warmth and endless promises now looked like 2 heavy wooden doors bolted shut from the inside. In a rough, strained voice that sounded more broken than firm, he placed a laminated sheet from a prominent genetic testing facility onto her blanket. He told her not to try to manipulate him again, that the prenatal screening results were absolute, and that he was done making a fool of himself in front of all of Chicago for the sake of a lie. Elena took the paper with trembling hands. The typed letters blurred before her eyes, not because she doubted her own innocence, but because the sheer depth of the trap became instantly clear. They hadn't just framed her for betrayal, they had successfully turned her husband's own fragile pride into the ultimate weapon against her. The silence that followed was so thick that the hum of the climate control system sounded like an intruder. Julian Vance then slid a heavy silver fountain pen across the white sheet, resting it inches from Elena's fingers, as though offering a graceful exit. In reality, he was nudging her off a legal cliff. He gently advised that if she signed tonight, they could maintain complete discretion, avoid public embarrassment, and allow her to leave before the birth, with a generous financial settlement to rebuild her life far away. But if she refused, the matter would become public. They would file for emergency protective orders, citing emotional instability during pregnancy, and they would ensure she never laid eyes on the child after delivery. In the face of that ruthless ultimatum, Elena met Mark's gaze directly for the first time since he had walked into the room. Instead of screaming or begging, she asked him a simple, quiet question that cut far deeper than any insult. If he truly believed in his heart that she was capable of deceiving him like this, why had he refused to sit down with her, look into her eyes, and review the medical timeline together? Mark didn't answer right away. His jaw tightened, and he took a step back, as if afraid that a single moment of doubt would trigger a flood he couldn't control. It was Beatrice who answered for him, reminding her son that men of their standing could not afford sentimentality when the reputation of a healthcare network, 5 surgical centers, and thousands of shareholders was on the line. As if love, trust, and motherhood were merely line items to be written off as collateral damage. The door clicked open briefly to admit a young nurse with a nervous expression who changed the IV bag on the stand without daring to raise her eyes. Elena caught a subtle flicker of guilt on the young woman's face, a hint that even among the floor staff, rumors were beginning to circulate about the pregnant woman being backed into a corner by the powerful family funding the wing. When the door shut again, Beatrice stepped closer to the bed. She stated plainly that the Serrano name would not be tainted by uncertainty, that the baby would be delivered under the care of their own medical directors, and that if Elena possessed a shred of decency left, she would sign the agreement before destroying whatever little dignity she had remaining. It was then that Elena truly understood what was happening in that room. They weren't settling a divorce. They were orchestrating the quiet, systematic theft of her future. To understand why a prominent Chicago family was so desperate to silence a young pregnant woman, one had to look back 6 months, to a time when Elena still believed that love could survive inside a house built on long-buried secrets. It was early spring, a time when the city was just shaking off the winter chill, and the air smelled of wet earth and lake breezes. The marriage still maintained the polished appearance of perfect harmony, and the greatest threat Elena faced seemed to be nothing more than the cold, critical glare Beatrice Serrano cast over every step her daughter-in-law took. 6 months earlier, Elena had walked into the annual Serrano Foundation Charity Gala at the Drake Hotel, wearing a simple dark blue dress. Modest, elegant, and entirely understated compared to the glittering gowns of the women moving through the ballroom like peacocks. Even after 3 years of marriage to Mark, Elena often felt like an outsider in this world of double-barreled surnames, private club dinners, and carefully measured smiles. Yet that evening, she had held her husband's arm with a quiet, glowing joy, because she was carrying a secret she couldn't wait to share with him once they were alone. She was pregnant. Before suspicion poisoned his mind, Mark used to look at her with genuine devotion. He introduced her to board members as his proudest achievement, appearing for a brief time like a man who had finally stepped out from beneath his family's suffocating shadow. Elena had met him miles away from high society galas, while coordinating a community health initiative in a working-class neighborhood on the South Side. Mark had been sent there by his family to polish the corporate group's public image, but he had ended up meeting a woman who wasn't impressed by tailored suits, executive titles, or family money. Elena worked with quiet dedication, managing outreach programs for families who couldn't afford care, and Mark found in her grounded nature something he had never encountered among his peers, an unshakable honesty that asked for nothing in return. He pursued her, learned to listen to her, and fell in love with an intensity that his mother privately considered absurd. Elena hadn't married a fortune. She had married a man who, for a short while, seemed ready to build a real life on his own terms. From the day of their wedding, however, Beatrice Serrano made it clear that her acceptance came with invisible strings. Elena began noticing them in small, subtle ways that seemed trivial at first, until they accumulated into a wall of hostility. Her mother-in-law commented on her wardrobe choices, corrected her tone when speaking to foundation donors, and dropped quiet remarks about how a woman without a notable family background needed to be twice as refined to avoid embarrassing the family that had taken her in. Above all, Beatrice watched her with a cold, watchful courtesy that felt less like maternal concern and more like an owner inspecting property. Mark used to brush it off, telling Elena that his mother was tough on everyone and would eventually soften. But Elena sensed that behind Beatrice's social perfection lay a sharp, defensive edge. The news of the pregnancy had arrived on a bright April morning. After weeks of fatigue, Elena saw the 2 lines appear on the test strip and stood frozen in her small kitchen, laughing and crying all at once. When she told Mark, he pulled her into his arms with clumsy, pure excitement, lifting her off her feet as he swore their child would grow up surrounded by warmth, far away from the rigid expectations of his own upbringing. For a few short weeks, their home felt entirely renewed. Fresh flowers appeared on the bedside table. Affectionate text messages arrived in the middle of the workday, and they spent late evenings talking softly about nursery colors and family names. Even Beatrice performed a convincing display of grandmotherly delight, arranging consultations with top maternal fetal specialists and sending over imported vitamins. It felt like an overwhelming amount of attention, but Elena was too happy to see the tight net of control being woven around her. What no one explained to Elena was that her pregnancy did not simply represent the arrival of a grandchild. It triggered a delicate shift on the financial chessboard of the Serrano family empire. The late patriarch of the family had established a complex living trust years prior. Under its terms, the birth of Mark's first legitimate child would automatically trigger a major release of shares and voting rights into a child's trust, effectively diluting Beatrice's absolute control over the health network's executive board. Designed decades ago to prevent any single family member from wielding unchecked power, this clause turned the unborn baby into something far more significant than a cherished child. He was a high-stakes corporate asset. Beatrice, accustomed to ruling her family and her board without opposition, realized that if Elena became the mother of the primary heir, she would hold permanent legal standing, public visibility, and potential access to sensitive historical documents that were never meant to leave the family vaults. From that moment on, the surveillance became meticulous and quiet. Beatrice personally selected Elena's obstetricians, transferred her medical files to a flagship facility within the Serrano health system, and announced that for safety reasons, all prenatal monitoring would be handled internally where the quality of care could be guaranteed. It sounded like an act of grand generosity, but time would reveal its true, calculating purpose. Mark, occupied with expanding a new surgical clinic in nearby Evanston, accepted these arrangements with relief. believing his mother was simply taking care of his wife. Elena, though vaguely uncomfortable with the lack of privacy, yielded for the sake of peace, wanting her pregnancy to be a time of tranquility, completely unaware that her desire to avoid conflict was being used to set her up. One rainy afternoon in May, while returning early to the family's estate in Lake Forest to drop off some paperwork, Elena overheard a low conversation in the library between Beatrice and Julian Vance. Though she only caught fragments through the heavy oak door, one sentence burned itself into her mind. If that girl ever figures out who her father really was, we won't just lose board seats. We'll lose everything. Elena didn't step inside. Every instinct told her to pretend she had heard nothing. But from that day forward, a strange weight hung over every interaction with her mother-in-law. It was a shadow that didn't seem to belong to her marriage, but to something much older, something that predated her relationship with Mark, perhaps even her own birth. When Elena later made a gentle, indirect inquiry about old family acquaintances, Beatrice smiled with icy perfection and remarked that powerful families were always plagued by ridiculous rumors. Elena had grown up with painful gaps in her own history. She had been raised entirely by her mother, Inez Navarro, a quiet, dignified seamstress who rarely spoke about the past. Before Inez passed away during Elena's senior year of college, she had offered only one firm piece of advice: never let wealthy people define her worth or compromise her dignity. Elena had never known her father, had never received a straight answer about him, and possessed only a single childhood keepsake, an old silver pendant on a delicate chain that her mother had instructed her to keep safe, even if she didn't understand its meaning. The overheard line in the library stirred a quiet ache Elena had carried for years, though at the time she could not possibly link it to Beatrice's growing coldness or to the strange, searching looks certain elderly board members gave her whenever she attended Foundation events. The trap sprung with engineered precision a few weeks later. Beatrice casually suggested during a Sunday brunch that Elena undergo a routine, non-invasive prenatal genetic screen, framing it as a standard precaution to rule out underlying conditions. Mark, exhausted by corporate demands, saw no reason to object. Elena signed the consent forms, trusting the medical institution that her husband's family owned and operated. A soft-spoken lab technician named Martha Ruiz drew her blood with gentle, careful hands, treating the appointment like any other standard visit. In the days that followed, Elena noticed a subtle shift in the household. Conversations abruptly ended whenever she entered a room. Private meetings were held behind closed doors between Beatrice and the family attorneys, and Mark began pulling away into heavy, somber silences. It was as though a dark secret had been handed to him, and he was choosing to suffer under its weight alone, rather than talk to his wife. The first real crack in their marriage showed during dinner one evening. Mark barely touched his plate, answering Elena's questions with short, clipped sentences. When they finally went upstairs, he asked her in a voice stripped of all tenderness if there was anything she needed to confess before things went any further. The question was so surreal, so completely alien to the trust they had built, that Elena felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. She looked at him in disbelief, calmly asking what on earth he was talking about. Mark simply stared at her, his jaw set, and muttered that he would have documented proof soon enough, adding that he hoped he hadn't been as naive as everyone in his family had warned him he was. The words were so clearly planted by his mother that they barely sounded like his own. After that night, their home ceased to feel like a haven. It felt like a stage where everyone was reading from a script Elena hadn't been allowed to see. The staff avoided making eye contact with her. Beatrice offered suffocatingly polite check-ins and herbal teas, while quietly organizing dinners with key board members. and Mark began spending his nights at his downtown office. When Elena tried to reach out to him, she was met with a wall of wounded pride. She left notes, begged him to attend an outside medical appointment with her, and suggested redoing any tests at an independent clinic. But Mark refused every attempt. It was as if he were terrified that investigating the truth might dismantle not only the story he had been fed, but the comfortable habit of obeying his mother. The realization that something was deeply wrong came to Elena through a small, seemingly insignificant detail. While organizing her personal papers, she stumbled across a lab requisition form from her initial blood draw. The patient tracking number printed on the paperwork did not match the code on the plastic identification wristband she had saved from her appointment. It was a minor discrepancy that most people would have overlooked, but it set off an alarm in her mind. She took clear photographs of both numbers and tried contacting Martha Ruiz directly, unsure if she was looking at a clerical mistake or something far more sinister. What she did know was that no family goes to such extreme lengths to force a separation over a simple personal doubt, and Beatrice's intense fixation on the baby concealed a motive far more dangerous than ordinary dislike. The night before Elena ended up in the hospital, she made one final attempt to save her marriage. She went to Mark's private study holding a recent ultrasound photo, desperate to remind him of the man who had wept with joy when he first heard their baby's heartbeat. She found him sitting in the dark behind his desk, staring at an open folder. Before she could say a word, he slid a sealed lab report across the desk. It stated in cold, stark terms that the probability of his paternity was 0%. Elena denied it with absolute, unwavering conviction. But Mark was a man who had been raised to defer to authority, credentials, and his mother's counsel. The confrontation ended not with shouting, but with something far colder. Mark quietly asking her to pack a bag and wait for instructions from Julian Vance. Hours later, the severe stress and emotional devastation triggered early, painful contractions. Elena found herself alone in her room, doubled over in pain, paralyzed by a terrifying isolation. Beatrice immediately stepped in, insisting that Elena be admitted straight to Serrano Memorial Hospital, claiming it was the only place equipped to handle a high-risk situation involving the family. Though Elena tried to insist on going to Northwestern or Rush, the intensifying pain left her with no strength to argue, and so she found herself back in that sterile VIP suite on a stormy Chicago night, facing the silver fountain pen, the navy blue folder, and a devastating question that nobody in the room was willing to answer. If the child truly wasn't a Serrano, why were they all so terrified of letting him go? Just before Julian Vance could push the pen closer to Elena's trembling hand, Beatrice's phone buzzed sharply against the wooden tabletop. She frowned, glanced down at the screen, and for a fraction of a second, the color drained completely from her face. She recovered her composure almost instantly, slipping the device into her pocket with a stiff, abrupt movement. Elena didn't see the text message, but she felt the sudden shift in the room's atmosphere. A tight, desperate tension that went far beyond mere corporate cruelty. Beatrice leaned over the bed, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. She urged Elena to sign the papers immediately if she didn't want outside trouble making things infinitely worse for herself. But that threat, meant to crush her resolve, had the opposite effect. It sparked a quiet certainty in Elena's mind. There was a hidden piece to this puzzle, something her mother-in-law feared far more than a public divorce scandal. Down in the main lobby, a private elevator was opening to carry a small group of men in dark suits up to the executive floor. Walking among them was a tall, silver-haired man in his late 60s, whose very name commanded quiet respect among civic leaders, corporate boards, and legal circles across Illinois. No one inside the VIP room realized it yet, but his arrival was about to shatter the narrative the Serrano family had carefully constructed, transforming the isolated woman in the hospital bed into the centerpiece of a truth that could no longer be kept underground. Elena lay back against the pillows, her hand resting protectively over her belly, refusing to pick up the pen. She had no way of knowing that on the very night they attempted to strip away her child, a long-lost part of her own legacy was finally coming back to find her. 3 weeks prior to that night in the hospital, Mark had received the phone call that fractured his reality. He had been sitting in an executive committee meeting when his mother summoned him up to her private office. Upon entering, he found a sealed envelope resting on her glass desk, an untouched glass of scotch beside it, and Julian Vance staring out the window with practiced solemnity. Beatrice didn't ask her son to sit down before delivering the news. The prenatal screening had revealed an absolute genetic incompatibility between him and the child. Mark felt the air leave his lungs, not because he instantly believed the claim, but because his mother spoke with the absolute certainty of someone who had been waiting for the right moment to deliver a fatal blow. He read the document multiple times, searching for a typo, a misplaced decimal, or anything that would allow him to reject it. Julian smoothly stepped in, explaining that the blood sample had been processed through 2 internal reference labs and that both facilities produced identical findings. Beatrice added, with a show of quiet sympathy, that Elena had spent numerous afternoons away from home during the early months of her pregnancy, meeting with old community organizers and former colleagues. An innocent truth twisted into an insinuation of infidelity. Mark returned to his townhouse that night ready to demand answers, but when he found Elena asleep with her hand resting gently on her stomach, he couldn't bring himself to wake her. Instead, he locked the report in his desk drawer, where doubt began to fester. The reality behind the report was far more sinister. 2 days before that executive meeting, the director of the hospital's Central Diagnostics Department, Dr. Arthur Sterling, had received an unannounced late-night visit from Beatrice and Julian Vance. Dr. Sterling nervously pointed out that altering a prenatal paternity result was a severe federal offense, and that the laboratory's digital audit trail logged every manual override. In response, Beatrice placed a manila folder on his desk containing detailed records of his daughter's stay at a private addiction treatment center, along with evidence of minor financial irregularities he had committed years ago to cover her expenses. She didn't make an explicit threat. She simply noted that past mistakes could remain forgotten if he cooperated, whereas a lack of loyalty would force the hospital network to review its internal auditing standards. Dr. Sterling understood that his career, his freedom, and his family's privacy depended on his compliance. The original blood sample drawn from Elena had been logged under a system control number ending in 719. The falsified report handed to Mark bore a requisition number ending in 971, a subtle numerical transposition intended to look like a simple administrative typo if questioned. Martha Ruiz, the lab technician who had drawn the blood, noticed the discrepancy when the system prompted her to sign off on an amended file that didn't match the initial accession log. When she raised the issue with Dr. Sterling, he cut her off sharply, telling her to close the screen, forget what she had seen, and finish her shift. Martha pretended to comply, but she quietly copied both reference numbers onto a slip of paper and hid it in her personal locker. She had worked in diagnostic testing for nearly a decade and knew that authorized personnel never swap tracking numbers without a formal chain of custody order, especially not for the wife of the corporate group's executive vice president. Meanwhile, Beatrice methodically isolated Elena from any potential support. She instructed the household staff to log Elena's movements, monitored security feeds around the estate, and placed temporary spending limits on her joint accounts under the guise of an internal family audit. She then subtly shared a photo with Mark showing Elena sitting in a downtown cafe with an older gentleman, intentionally omitting the fact that he was a retired attorney who had once known her late mother. The photograph was all it took to feed the flames of Mark's growing insecurity. When he asked who the man was, Beatrice responded with calculated restraint, stating that she preferred not to make accusations without absolute proof, a line designed to sound protective while confirming his worst fears. Elena felt her husband pulling away long before she understood why. He stopped touching her stomach when he got home, avoided looking at ultrasound pictures, and reacted with sharp irritation to any conversation about the nursery. One evening, while looking at paint samples, he slammed the catalog shut and asked how long she had been keeping secrets with men his family knew nothing about. Surprised, Elena explained she had merely been looking into old legal documents left behind by her mother. But Mark interpreted her confusion as defensive guilt. Rather than showing her the report, he walked out of the room and called his mother, who advised him to stay quiet, claiming that a guilty person always makes a slip when they believe their secret is safe. Over the next week, Elena tried to find a logical explanation for her husband's sudden hostility. She wondered if he was buckling under corporate pressure, if the thought of fatherhood terrified him, or if Beatrice was orchestrating another family crisis to assert dominance. But nothing justified the cold contempt in his eyes. Finally, she found the lab report hidden in an unlocked drawer in his study. Reading the document, Elena felt a wave of shock, followed by fierce anger, and then a cold, sharp clarity. She knew with absolute certainty that Mark was the father, which meant the test had been intentionally forged. She didn't break down. Instead, she photographed every page, noted the dates, and cross-referenced the tracking numbers with her original wristband, confirming the numerical swap that exposed the manipulation. When she confronted Mark with the evidence, he proved completely incapable of hearing her. Elena placed both tracking numbers side by side on the table, pointing out that they didn't match, but Mark dismissed it as an internal coding variation and accused her of grasping at straws to cover her tracks. She begged him to go to an independent clinic that very afternoon for a retest, but Mark refused instantly. Beatrice had already warned him that Elena would attempt to swap samples at an outside facility. The more logical and urgent Elena's pleas became, the more suspicious they appeared within the paranoid narrative his mother had built. In that moment, Elena realized she wasn't fighting a piece of paper. She was fighting decades of psychological conditioning that had taught Mark to trust his family's fear over the woman he had sworn to love. The final public fracture occurred during a board luncheon at the Serrano estate in Lake Forest. Beatrice deliberately invited several key shareholders along with Clara Mercer, an ambitious chief medical officer from a partner hospital, and Mark's former fiancée. Elena arrived unaware of the social ambush. From the moment she sat down, she watched Clara sit next to Mark, discuss corporate expansion plans, and interact with Beatrice with an easy familiarity that felt intentionally pointed. When Elena softly asked why she hadn't been informed about the nature of the luncheon, Beatrice replied loudly enough for the table to hear that certain high-level discussions were best reserved for individuals whose loyalty to the family was beyond question. Though no explicit mention was made of the pregnancy, the knowing glances shared around the table turned the remark into an intentional public humiliation. Mark sat in silence, failing to defend his wife, a silence that cut far deeper than his mother's cruelty. Elena left the dining room, but Clara followed her down the hallway. Under the guise of gentle professional concern, Clara advised Elena to prioritize her health, avoid unnecessary stress, and refrain from fighting a family that possessed the resources to prove whatever they needed to in court. The threat was wrapped in polished politeness, But Elena understood that Clara was in on the plan. Returning home, Elena began quietly gathering every document she could find. Personal records, prenatal logs, text messages from Mark around the time of conception, and any paper that could offer protection. She knew that an isolated pregnant woman with no financial independent access could easily be portrayed as unstable by a powerful healthcare family that controlled the doctors, the lawyers, and the hospitals. Her best hope lay with Martha Ruiz, whose signature appeared on the original blood draw log. Elena called her from a burner phone, asking to meet outside the hospital, but Martha was hesitant, terrified that her calls were being monitored. It was only when Elena mentioned the discrepancy between Code 7119 and Code 971 that a heavy silence fell over the line. Martha agreed to meet at a small diner near Union Station. She arrived 20 minutes late, out of uniform, constantly checking over her shoulder. Before sitting down, Martha warned that she couldn't stay long. Her system credentials had been flagged earlier that morning, and Dr. Sterling had questioned her about whether she had spoken to anyone about the Serrano file. Martha explained that the original uncorrupted sample had indeed been processed, and the preliminary findings showed clear genetic compatibility with Mark. But before she could print the final verification sheet, an administrator locked the file and replaced it with a modified record. She also revealed that she had seen Julian Vance leaving the central lab late at night, an unprecedented visit for a corporate attorney, and noted that the lab's secure server maintained an automatic hidden audit log that average users couldn't delete. Elena begged for a copy of that audit log, but Martha was terrified of losing her job and losing the financial aid scholarship her younger brother relied on, which was funded through a Serrano Foundation grant. Martha promised to look for a safe way to extract the file, handed Elena a handwritten napkin with the original access codes, and urged her not to return to the hospital alone. 2 days later, Martha was abruptly suspended over an alleged procedural error involving an unrelated patient, and her brother received a formal notice that his scholarship was under review. Martha understood the message. She called Elena in tears, begging her not to contact her again, but before hanging up, she blurted out that the authentic record still existed on an off-site backup server. That piece of information confirmed everything. Beatrice hadn't just altered a test. She was actively destroying anyone who threatened to expose the truth. Elena decided to seek help from the retired attorney she had met with weeks earlier, the man from the photograph. His name was Samuel Vance, no relation to Julian Vance, a veteran litigator who had spent decades representing minority shareholders against large corporate entities. When Elena mentioned the name associated with her mother's old documents, Rafael Valdez, Samuel's entire demeanor shifted, as if a long-closed chapter of Chicago history had suddenly been reopened. Samuel asked her to walk with him in a quiet park near the lakefront, away from phones and offices. He explained that decades ago, Rafael Valdez had been one of the most prominent pioneers in the biomedical technology sector in the Midwest before abruptly stepping back from public life following a bitter corporate dispute. According to industry records that were never fully publicized, several business partners took advantage of a legal vulnerability to seize his patents and corporate assets while he was overseas dealing with a complex regulatory battle. One of the key figures in that takeover was Mark's late father, Richard Serrano. Elena felt the pieces coming together, but Samuel cautioned her against making assumptions without physical proof. He asked to see the silver pendant she wore around her neck. When she handed it to him, Samuel immediately recognized the engraved emblem. It was the original insignia of the Valdez Bioscience Group. He told her that the pendant wasn't merely a piece of jewelry. It was a custom token given only to direct family members. Elena returned to her mother's old apartment in Pilsen, a place she had kept locked since Inez's passing. She searched through dusty boxes, old sewing patterns, and carefully preserved family photos. Hidden beneath a false bottom in an old wooden sewing box, she discovered a small lockbox that opened when she pressed the edge of her silver pendant into a matching groove on the latch. Inside lay yellowed letters addressed to Rafael Valdez, copies of wire transfers, a photograph of her young mother standing beside a striking man with intense, dark eyes, and an incomplete birth certificate where the father's name had been neatly blacked out. In the letters, Inez wrote of being followed, of subtle threats made against her safety, and of a desperate promise to stay hidden until it was safe. None of the letters had ever been mailed. Accompanying the letters was a note written by Inez just months before her death. In it, she warned Elena that the Serrano family might one day recognize her because of the pendant, pleading with her daughter never to trust them and never to let them claim authority over her life or her future children. Reading those words as her baby kicked gently in her womb, Elena realized that the assault on her marriage hadn't started with the pregnancy or the fake lab report. It had begun decades ago. The Serrano family wasn't just afraid of losing corporate control to an unborn heir. They were terrified that the daughter of Rafael Valdez would realize who she was and reclaim the legacy they had stolen. While Elena gathered evidence, Beatrice moved to finalize the legal trap. Julian Vance drafted a settlement agreement that subtly referred to the baby as a potential heir to the Serrano estate in a private clause, even while the family publicly maintained he was not Mark's child. Tucked inside an obscure addendum was a provision allowing the Serrano Health Network to seek immediate temporary custody if the mother was deemed mentally or emotionally unfit. To build that case, they had already begun documenting Elena's distress, her frantic phone calls to the lab, and her arguments with Mark as evidence of severe prenatal instability. Clara Mercer had even drafted a preliminary clinical note recommending psychiatric evaluation, converting a mother's terror into a useful legal weapon. The breaking point came when Elena confronted Mark with the hidden custody addendum, asking why his family was labeling her baby an heir in a confidential document while accusing her of infidelity in public. Mark read the clause with genuine confusion, but before he could process it, Beatrice stepped into the room. She coolly claimed it was standard legal language drafted to protect all parties, then accused Elena of stealing confidential files and using her pregnancy to extort the family. During the argument, Mark caught a flicker of genuine fear in his mother's eyes, an expression that didn't belong in a simple marital dispute. But instead of probing further, he allowed his mother to lead him out of the room, leaving Elena alone with the terrifying knowledge that her husband would always choose comfortable obedience over the truth. That same evening, Martha managed to briefly access the off-site backup server using a colleague's credentials and secured a partial screenshot of the original uncorrupted genetic match. The image clearly showed a 99.9% paternity match with Mark, though it lacked the final digital signature needed for court admissibility. Martha encrypted the image and sent it to Elena from an anonymous address before disposing of her phone. Elena printed the screenshot, hid it with her mother's letters, and called Samuel to prepare an emergency court petition. But before she could leave her apartment, a sharp, violent pain doubled her over. The relentless stress had triggered early labor contractions. An ambulance arrived in less than 6 minutes, alarmingly fast. The paramedics wore uniforms from Serrano Memorial Hospital, claiming they had responded to an automated alert from her home monitoring system, and feature Elena had never activated. She demanded to be taken to Northwestern, but as another severe contraction hit, the paramedic insisted her vitals were unstable and that Serrano Memorial was the closest facility equipped for her specific risk profile. Fearing for her baby's life, Elena yielded. During the ride, she reached into her bag for the folder containing her evidence, only to find it missing. One of the paramedics had quietly slid it out while checking her pulse. When the ambulance pulled into the private bay at Serrano Memorial, the doors closed behind her. Beatrice was waiting in the hallway alongside Julian Vance, holding a navy blue folder. Elena woke up hours later in the VIP suite, hooked to an IV drip containing medication to suppress contractions. A nurse informed her that she was under observation, but refused to say who had ordered the medication. Mark arrived shortly after, looking hollow and pale, accompanied by his mother and Julian. They placed the final divorce and custody surrender documents on her bed. Elena realized she had been brought to the one place where every door, every doctor, and every record was under her enemy's control. But as she looked at the silver pen resting on the tray, she remembered that Martha held a piece of the truth, that Samuel knew the name Rafael Valdez, and that her mother had spent a lifetime proving that dignity could not be bought. She took the pen, held it over the paper, and looked up, determined to hold out long enough for the truth to break through. Elena held the silver pen motionless between her fingers, pretending to read the fine print, while mentally mapping out her options. She knew she couldn't sign, but an outright refusal would give Julian Vance the leverage he needed to claim she was being uncooperative and medically unstable. In a quiet, measured voice, she requested more time to review the clauses, claiming the IV medication was making it difficult to concentrate on legal language. Julian voiced a slick objection, but Mark, clearly unsettled by the strict custody clauses he hadn't fully understood, agreed to give her an hour. As the room cleared, leaving security guards posted outside, Elena discovered a tightly folded note tucked beneath her meal tray. It was a scribbled message from Martha, delivered through a sympathetic floor nurse, telling her not to lose hope and confirming that Samuel Vance had just been sent a copy of the backup files. Elena hid the note inside her pillowcase, closed her eyes, and placed her hand over her abdomen, making a silent vow to her unborn child that she would not let them turn his life into a corporate bargaining chip. Several floors below, Martha was hiding in a restricted records room, well aware that hospital security was reviewing badge access logs to track her down. After being suspended, she had realized that hiding would only give Beatrice time to wipe the off-site servers. Using a borrowed keycard, she had managed to download the complete unedited audit log onto an encrypted flash drive, documenting every instance where Dr. Sterling had accessed the file under executive orders. Samuel Vance received the encrypted drive at a quiet diner near Union Station. Reviewing the data on an air-gapped laptop, he saw clear proof that the original genetic report had been overwritten within 40 minutes of its initial upload. But he also knew that a digital file without a sworn witness or a chain of custody would be aggressively challenged by the Serrano family's legal team. They needed Dr. Sterling's direct testimony, a certified server image, and an emergency injunction before the hospital could purge the records. Achieving all of that before Elena was forced to sign seemed nearly impossible. Samuel knew there was only one move left to make. He had to contact the man whose name had haunted Beatrice Serrano for 30 years. He dialed an unlisted number he had preserved for over 2 decades. When the line connected, Samuel didn't open with pleasantries or legal jargon. He simply stated that he was representing a young woman named Elena Navarro, who wore a Valdez family pendant and was currently being held under distress in a Serrano hospital suite. Silence stretched across the line for so long that Samuel thought the call had dropped. Then, a deep, grave voice asked for Elena's exact age, her mother's name, and her place of birth. As Samuel provided the details, he could hear the man's breath catch. For nearly 30 years, Rafael Valdez had been led to believe that the child his young love carried had died shortly after birth. He demanded to see Inez's unmailed letters immediately. Within 45 minutes, a private car picked up Samuel and brought him to a secluded estate in Lake Forest, situated just miles away from the Serrano family mansion. Rafael Valdez's home was striking, filled with towering bookshelves, rare art, and an overwhelming sense of quiet solitude. On his desk sat a framed, faded photograph of Inez Navarro, taken in the late 1990s, identical to the picture Elena had found in the sewing box. Beside it rested a small, unworn silver baby bracelet, engraved with the name Elena. Raphael listened in utter silence as Samuel outlined Elena's marriage, her pregnancy, the altered lab report, and the forced confinement at the hospital. But when Samuel explained that Beatrice Serrano was personally directing the operation to strip Elena of her child, Raphael slammed his hand onto the desk with a cold, terrifying fury. He revealed that Beatrice wasn't just trying to protect a corporate board. She was attempting to erase the daughter of the man her family had ruined decades ago. Raphael explained that in the late 1990s, he had worked closely with Inez, a talented bioengineering designer, to patent a revolutionary line of biocompatible surgical materials. They had fallen in love away from the public eye, but before they could marry, Raphael was targeted in a sophisticated corporate smear campaign that forced him to travel to Europe to defend his international assets. He left the temporary management of his domestic patents in the hands of his trusted business associate, Richard Serrano, Mark's father. While Raphael was overseas, Beatrice called him with devastating news. She claimed Inez had suffered severe birth complications, that the baby girl had died in delivery, and that a heartbroken Inez had left the city and refused all contact. The lie was reinforced with forged medical certificates and a burial record for an unnamed infant, a grave Raphael visited for years, unaware it belonged to another family. By the time Raphael cleared his name and returned to the U.S., Inez had vanished. In truth, Richard and Beatrice Serrano had threatened Inez with fabricated criminal charges, warning her that they would use their influence to take her baby if she ever tried to reach Raphael. They forced her to change her name, move to a working-class neighborhood in Chicago, and live under quiet surveillance. In exchange, the Serrano family seized control of Raphael's core biomedical patents, assets that became the foundational technology for the entire Serrano health network. Samuel finally understood the full picture. Elena was not only Raphael's daughter, she was the rightful legal heir to the fundamental technology powering the Serrano empire. Inez's hidden letters contained patent numbers, dates, and bank records exposing the entire fraudulent transfer. Furthermore, the silver pendant Elena wore contained a microscopic mechanical key designed to open a safe deposit box registered jointly to Raphael and Inez in 1998, a box containing original partnership deeds that Richard Serrano had spent decades trying to locate. Beatrice had allowed Mark to marry Elena initially because she believed keeping the unsuspecting heir close was the easiest way to monitor her and ensure the safe deposit key was never discovered. But Elena's pregnancy altered everything. An unborn child who was both a Serrano heir and a Valdez descendant would merge the two legacies legally, giving Elena's child ultimate claim over the corporate network. To prevent that, Beatrice had devised a cold, calculated strategy: ruin the marriage, paint Elena as unfaithful and mentally unstable, claim the baby as a Serrano heir through internal custody arrangements, and cast Elena out completely. Raphael wasted no time. He summoned his senior legal team, demanding an immediate emergency court injunction, a forensic audit of the hospital's servers, and an expedited court-ordered DNA test between himself and Elena. He also contacted a retired federal judge who had investigated corporate healthcare fraud in the Midwest. When his attorneys cautioned that acting too aggressively might allow Beatrice to claim he was interfering in a private family matter, Raphael looked at them with cold disdain. He stated that he had spent 30 years being cautious while monsters controlled his daughter's life, and he would not wait another second while they tried to steal his grandchild. Back in the VIP room, Clara Mercer entered wearing a lab coat, carrying a medical clipboard. Though she wasn't Elena's attending physician, she took a seat by the bed and gently suggested that Elena's stress levels were threatening the pregnancy, hinting that agreeing to a voluntary psychiatric hold would demonstrate maturity and help her in the long run. Elena saw right through the tactic. She looked Clara in the eye and asked who had authorized the setup of a high-risk neonatal suite specifically reserved for a Serrano heir, weeks before the fake paternity test had even been issued. Clara stumbled over her words, her polished demeanor cracking for a brief second, confirming that the outcome had been planned all along. Elena waited until she was alone again, looking for any way to send a message. The room's landline was restricted to internal extensions, and her cell phone was gone. But behind a curtain, she spotted a wall-mounted service panel used by nursing staff. She pressed the emergency call button, bringing a young auxiliary nurse named Sarah into the room. Elena feigned sudden dizziness to get the nurse close, then quietly slipped Martha's handwritten note into the woman's pocket, along with a scribbled plea for help addressed to Samuel Vance. The young nurse hesitated, terrified of the security guards outside, but Elena looked at her with quiet desperation and asked her to think about what she would want someone to do if it were her child. The nurse didn't say a word, but her hand tightened over her pocket as she walked out. 40 minutes later, Samuel received a photograph of the note on a secure line. Meanwhile, Martha confronted Dr. Sterling in the hospital's underground parking garage as he was trying to pack a briefcase into his car. He was visibly shaking, sweating despite the cool evening air. He tried to brush her off, but Martha held up a printout of the server audit log showing his master credentials. Cornered, Dr. Sterling broke down. He confessed that the original test proved Mark was the father with over 99.9% certainty, and that Beatrice had forced him to swap the result file. He also admitted that a physical, hard copy verification sheet had been printed and stored in a secure physical vault, because state law required paper records for prenatal genetic testing, a document Julian Vance was planning to retrieve and destroy that very night. Martha recorded his confession on her phone and offered him a choice: hand over the paper record and testify, or take the sole fall for corporate forgery when the federal investigation hit. Dr. Sterling agreed to cooperate. He led Martha through the service corridors to the secure archive room. But when they unlocked the cabinet, they found the file folder missing. Julian Vance had retrieved it just 15 minutes earlier. Security footage showed Julian putting the manila folder into a black leather briefcase and heading toward the executive exit. Martha alerted Samuel, whose team tracked Julian's car as it drove away from the hospital. Instead of heading to his office, Julian drove directly to the old, vacant Serrano estate in Oak Park, a property that had been closed since Richard Serrano's death, where Beatrice kept private archives away from corporate auditors. Inside the quiet mansion, Julian met Beatrice in a dimly lit library. She took the original lab report, verified the 99.9% match, and ordered him to burn it in the fireplace alongside the letters her security team had stolen from Elena's apartment. But Julian, driven by self-preservation, began to panic. He realized that if federal authorities got involved, Beatrice would frame him as the sole architect of the forgery. While Beatrice turned her back to check her phone, Julian secretly slipped the final signature page of the authentic lab report into his inner coat pocket before throwing the rest of the folder into the flames. A personal insurance policy he hoped would buy him immunity if everything fell apart. Unbeknownst to them, Raphael's private security team was monitoring the estate from the street, and the property's automated security network was quietly recording high-definition video that synced directly to an off-site server. At the hospital, Mark was finally beginning to see the cracks in his mother's story. Searching through her private office on the executive floor, he found a personal calendar logging multiple unrecorded meetings with Dr. Sterling weeks before the genetic test had even been ordered. He confronted Beatrice when she returned to the floor, demanding to know why she had been consulting with the diagnostic director in secret. Beatrice brushed it off, claiming she was simply overseeing high-risk protocol for her future grandchild. But when Mark asked why she kept referring to the baby as an heir when the report claimed it wasn't his, Beatrice snapped, stating that in the business world, bloodlines were whatever the family needed them to be. The remark chilled Mark to the bone. It revealed a cold, transactional reality that shattered his belief in his mother's protection. He realized he had allowed his pride and fear to be manipulated into destroying his own wife. He walked back into Elena's room, finding her sitting up in bed, the unsigned surrender papers still resting on her lap. For a long moment, neither spoke. Elena looked at him with a quiet, profound sadness, and asked if he was willing to walk out of that hospital right now, go to an independent clinic, and take a new test in front of a neutral witness, without his mother or Julian Vance present. Mark opened his mouth to answer, but before he could speak, the door swung open. Beatrice entered, flanked by Julian Vance and two hospital security officers. She announced that time had run out, that Elena's refusal to cooperate was endangering the child, and that they were executing an emergency medical hold to assume immediate guardianship. Julian placed a revised set of papers on the bed, informing Elena that if she didn't sign, she would be forcibly transferred to a secure psychiatric facility for evaluation. The threat was stark and unvarnished. Mark stepped forward, asking his mother since when their family used forced medical holds to strip a mother of her child. But Beatrice cut him off sharply, telling him to stay out of adult decisions. Just as Julian pushed the pen toward Elena's hand, Julian's phone rang. His assistant's panicked voice leaked through the speaker, informing him that federal marshals and state investigators had just entered the hospital's central server room with a forensic search warrant. Julian's face went completely white. Beatrice's eyes flashed with anger as she ordered the guards to lock the room and secure the signed documents before anyone could reach the floor. At that exact moment, the private elevator chimed. The heavy double doors at the end of the hallway opened, and a group of officials strode purposefully toward the suite, led by a tall, silver-haired man whose presence commanded immediate, absolute authority. The heavy doors to the VIP suite swung open before the security guards could react. An official from the state attorney general's office stepped into the room, flanked by two uniformed officers, Samuel Vance and Rafael Valdez. Rafael walked straight toward the bed, his dark eyes locked entirely on Elena, ignoring everyone else in the room. "Nobody is forcing this woman to sign anything," Rafael declared. His voice was calm, but it carried a deep, resonant weight that brought an immediate halt to the room. He placed an emergency injunction directly onto the table, a court order prohibiting any non-essential medical procedures, any involuntary transfers, or the signing of any legal agreements under duress. Beatrice recovered her footing instantly, stepping forward to demand by what authority an outsider dared to barge into a private hospital wing and interfere in a family matter. Raphael turned to face her, his gaze cold and steady. "I am not an outsider, Beatrice, and you know exactly who I am." Mark stepped between them, his face flushed with confusion and anger. He demanded to know who this man was and what connection he had to his wife, his mind still poisoned by the narrative his mother had constructed. Julian Vance tried to interject, warning that Raphael's presence was an illegal intrusion, but Raphael ignored him completely. Reaching into his coat, Raphael pulled out a small, worn velvet box. He opened it and set a delicate silver baby bracelet on the table beside Elena's pendant. The engraved insignia on the bracelet matched the silver key pendant around Elena's neck perfectly. "I am Elena's father," Raphael said softly, looking back at her. "The father you told me died 30 years ago, Beatrice. The child you hid away so your husband could steal my life's work." The words hung in the air like a thunderclap. Elena stared at the silver bracelet, then up at the man standing before her, her breath catching in her throat. The resemblance was undeniable. The shape of his eyes, the set of his jaw, the quiet intensity she had seen in old photographs of her mother. "That's impossible," Elena whispered, her voice trembling as tears finally spilled over her lashes. "It is the truth, Elena," Raphael said gently, his eyes shining with unspent grief. "Your mother spent her life hiding you to keep you safe from these people. But I have spent 30 years looking for you." Samuel Vance immediately stepped forward, presenting certified copies of the historical records, Inez's unmailed letters, and the preliminary results of an expedited DNA match performed using genetic markers preserved in Inez's personal lockbox. The probability of parentage between Raphael and Elena was over 99.9%. Beatrice tried to sneer, claiming the documents were elaborate forgeries created to extort her family, but the state official cut her off. He announced that a forensic team was already auditing the hospital's diagnostic servers, and that a court-appointed medical team was arriving to oversee Elena's care. Mark stood frozen, looking from his mother to Raphael, and then down at the falsified lab report he had carried in his pocket for weeks. "Mother, is this true?" he asked, his voice breaking. "Did you know who she was?" Beatrice didn't answer him. She turned her icy glare back onto Raphael, asking how much money he wanted to walk away and keep this out of the press. It was a response so cold, so devoid of maternal concern, that it shattered whatever remaining illusions Mark had held about his mother. Samuel Vance then pulled out a portable speaker and played the recorded confession of Dr. Arthur Sterling. The director's shaking voice filled the room, detailing how Beatrice and Julian Vance had blackmailed him into swapping Elena's blood test results, altering tracking numbers 719 and 971, and suppressing the original 99.9% paternity match, confirming Mark as the biological father. As the recording ended, Martha Ruiz stepped into the room accompanied by 2 state investigators. She handed over the encrypted flash drive containing the complete, uncorrupted server audit logs. Seeing his legal defenses evaporating, Julian Vance broke. He reached into his inner coat pocket, pulled out the authentic signed lab verification page he had saved from the fireplace, and handed it directly to the state official, attempting to secure a plea deal on the spot. The document was clear. Mark Serrano was unequivocally the biological father of Elena's child. Mark took the paper with shaking hands, reading his name beside the 99.9% match. The reality of what he had done crashed down upon him with crushing weight. He had allowed his mother to convince him that his devoted wife was unfaithful. He had abandoned her during her most vulnerable hours. He had almost let them strip away his child. He turned toward the bed, tears streaming down his face, and reached out for Elena's hand. "Elena! Oh, God! Elena, I'm so sorry. I didn't know." Elena looked at him, her expression free of anger. but filled with a profound, distant sadness. She pulled her hand back gently, resting it over her stomach. "You didn't want to know, Mark," she said softly, her voice steady despite her exhaustion. "You chose to believe them because it was easier than standing up for me." The state officers informed Beatrice and Julian Vance that they were being taken into custody for questioning regarding charges of corporate forgery, witness intimidation, illegal restraint, and evidence tampering. Beatrice held her head high as she was led out, refusing to look at her son. But her composure was hollow. The empire she had built on secrets and control was crumbling around her. As the room cleared, the medical monitor showed Elena's contractions beginning to stabilize. The court-appointed physician entered, confirming that Elena was safe and that she was being transferred to a private, independent wing at Northwestern Memorial Hospital under Raphael's personal protection. Mark asked to accompany the transport, but Elena quietly declined. She looked at him with clear eyes and told him that while he was the biological father of her child, he had forfeited the right to be her husband. She needed space, safety, and time to heal. Raphael walked beside Elena's gurney as she was moved to the transport vehicle. He didn't try to force a tearful reunion or make grand promises. He simply held her coat, walked at her pace, and assured her that no one would ever make a decision for her again. 4 weeks later, in a quiet, sunlit room at Northwestern Memorial, Elena gave birth to a healthy baby boy. She named him Mateo Inés Navarro, honoring the mother who had sacrificed everything to protect her dignity, and carrying forward a name built on truth. In the months that followed, the fallout from the Serrano scandal reshaped the Midwest healthcare landscape. Beatrice Serrano and Julian Vance faced multiple federal indictments for fraud, conspiracy, and evidence tampering. The Serrano Health Network was placed under independent judicial oversight, and the stolen biomedical patents were legally returned to the Valdez estate. Mark resigned from all executive positions, sold his corporate shares, and stepped away from high society completely. He enrolled in intensive counseling and established an independent, unmodifiable trust for Mateo's education and care. Though Elena allowed him structured, supervised visitation with his son, she remained firm in her decision to move forward alone. Mark accepted her boundaries without argument, realizing that true redemption lay in consistent, quiet respect rather than begging for forgiveness he hadn't earned. Rafael Valdez did not use his reclaimed wealth to build another corporate empire. Instead, he worked alongside Elena to establish the Inés Navarro Foundation, a nonprofit organization dedicated to providing free legal protection, medical advocacy, and safe housing for expectant mothers facing coercion, domestic abuse, or institutional exploitation. Elena chose to live in a modest townhouse near the lake, raising Mateo far away from the shadow of high society expectations. She built a relationship with her father gradually, grounded in mutual respect, quiet Sunday dinners, and long walks along the shore where they spoke openly about Inés and the years they had lost. Life rarely presents us with simple, neatly wrapped resolutions because human hearts are far too complex for straightforward answers. We often wander through seasons where power, prestige, and the loud demands of family tradition try to dictate who we ought to be, tempting us to trade our quiet integrity for the temporary safety of belonging. Yet, as the quiet victory of Elena's journey reminds us, true strength is never found in the titles we hold, the wealth we accumulate, or the prominent names we carry. It is found in the quiet, unyielding courage to stand firm in the truth, even when standing in that truth means standing entirely alone. For those who have walked through the long, dark valleys of betrayal, where those sworn to love and protect you chose fear over faith, the pain can feel like a permanent sentence. It is easy to let the cynicism of the world harden your spirit, to believe that truth is merely a tool used by the powerful to shape reality to their liking. But deceit, no matter how carefully constructed, carries within itself the seeds of its own destruction. A lie requires constant maintenance, an endless web of control, and a fortress of fear to sustain it. The truth requires only light, patience, and a single voice willing to ask the right question. To grow older with wisdom is to understand that bloodlines may offer us a beginning, but they do not get to write our ending. Paternity is a matter of biology, but fatherhood is an act of daily devotion, humility, and willingness to protect without possessing. Legacy is not a portfolio of shares, a family crest, or a building named in your honor. It is the moral foundation you leave behind for the ones who come after you. Inez Navarro had nothing to give her daughter except an old silver key, a few unmailed letters, and an unwavering sense of self-respect. Yet that simple inheritance proved far more powerful than all the corporate fortunes and legal teams the Serrano family could assemble. In the quiet moments of reflection, when the noise of conflict fades and the dust finally settles, we come to realize that the greatest healing does not come from witnessing the downfall of those who harmed us. It comes from the quiet moment when we look into the eyes of a child, or look at our own reflection in the mirror, and realize that we survived without losing our soul. We learn that we do not need to carry the bitterness of the past to honor the lessons it taught us, nor do we need to prove our worth to those who were determined not to see it. As the sun sets over the great waters of Lake Michigan, casting a warm golden light across the shoreline where a father and his daughter walk together with a sleeping child, the truth remains clear and gentle. No one can take away your dignity unless you choose to hand it over. No night is so dark that the light of truth cannot break through, and the most beautiful legacy you can ever build is a life lived in absolute, uncompromised freedom.